Friends, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Jim Maselos. He is a very well known name in the history of Indian national movement. At least for the last 30 years, Jim is working on modern Indian history with particular focus on Western India, and you will be happy to learn he got his PhD degree from Bombay University, I believe way back in 1965. Am I right?
Yes, exactly.
So, after that, since 1965 onwards till 2003, he is on and on Indian history. Started with modern Indian nationalist movement. He switched over to Indian art history. He has done extensive work on urban history. He had co-authored book with Professor Sujata Patel on Bombay. He had co-authored book on Delhi with Professor Narayani Gupta. Beside his own publications on nationalism, and then lately on the 100 years of Indian National Congress, he edited a volume from 1885 to 1985. So, it is a privilege to have Professor Jim with us in the studio, and I believe it is a rare occasion to get him in India and in IGNOU to hear from him his vast experience on Indian history, and he will be glad to share his ideas with us on various facets of how religion, culture and nationalism are integrated, particularly keeping in mind the late 19th century, which we can consider as a formative phase of Indian nationalist movement. Am I right, Professor Jim?
Yes, indeed.
So, we can start with some question, or you, if you like, you can share your initial experience when you started working on Indian nationalist movement, particularly in Bombay.
Thank you, and may I say how happy I am to be here and what a privilege it is to meet you and to talk with you. I first began researching on nationalism in Western India as a postgraduate student, and at that time what seemed to be important was to understand how the beginnings of an organized political movement happened. And it didn't just happen out of the blue. It wasn't some Englishman saying that he needed to start a political organization. It had a background of lots of different people becoming used to working together in various kinds of public associations, religious organizations, social organizations, and realizing the value of united action, and realizing also the need to articulate ideas of independence, freedom from British rule, and so on.
But at any stage, did you feel that the encounter with the colonial rule was an essential ingredient for the emergence of Indian national consciousness?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that the Indian people and people in India had ideas of their difference from the imperial ruler. There was inherent within the Indian social structure ideas of resistance and opposition, which was there regardless of what ruler would have been there. On the other hand, the British encounter brought a whole range of new ideas to India. European ideas of nationalism, European ideas of freedom, European ideas of political structures in which Indians should have the right to be represented, the right to vote, the right to elect their leaders. So the political philosophies of Europe and the nationalist ideologies of Europe of which there were numerous different kinds, were transmitted to India. And in the 19th century, as in the 20th century, brilliant Indian leaders, thinkers, were reading this material, just as nowadays your students here will be reading what
Yes.
Hannah Arendt is writing, or Jat or whoever, and they will be applying those ideas and testing them in these circumstances. So in the 19th century, Justice Ranade, Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee, all these people were, as intellectuals, reading what was happening around the world, and in the 19th century, unfortunately, that meant mainly Europe, and they were looking at their own circumstances and looking at how they could apply these ideas and see how they could change the patterns of power that existed under the British Raj. So somebody like Justice Ranade, for example, who is one of the great thinkers of the 19th century, rethought everything about Western India. He was one of those extraordinary people who was expert at whatever he did. As you know, he was a judge and had a role in the British structure of power, but he was also an organizer of the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, an organisation devoted to promoting the good of the people of Pune and the rest of Maharashtra. He believed in action to protest against administrative things the British were doing. But while he was doing that, he was rethinking Indian history. And he wrote an incredibly important book on the rise of the Maratha power, in which he examined how Shivaji Maharaj could reach the position he reached. And apart from the outstanding leadership qualities of Shivaji, Justice Ranade concluded that the background to Shivaji's rise was the way in which religion was being transformed at the time through the whole bhakti saint movement of the time. And he likened the rise of the Maratha power. He saw a similarity in the rise of the Maratha power with the Protestant Reformation in Europe and the rise of European nationalism. So Justice Ranade was one of the first major scholars to rethink a part of Indian history, and he then applied it to his own time. He began to rethink Hinduism as it was practiced in...
We'll come to
sorry.
that point later on, but what I can gather from your explanation, that it is not the response kind of syndrome to the Western ideas from which the nationalist thought emerged, right? Am I right?
Yes.
They were acquainted with the new ideas which were coming as a result of the British rule, but they applied their own mind in the context of the circumstances in which they lived for long years. Right?
Yes, yes.
So the local context had a larger bearing in the development of their thinking, rather than just we look at it as a response to the Western ideas, right?
Yes.
So from this, logically we can go to the other question, that the thought which was developing in the late 19th century, Maharashtra particularly, and we are discussing the development in Western India, was it a kind of monolith, or it's a unilinear response, or there are the different trends within the late 19th century thinking that was emerging in Western India?
Clearly, the people who emerged as leaders and major leaders, second leaders, were all people of great personality, difference of character, and clearly they had different approaches. They were, after all, individuals, but they were talking to one another, and they often shared common assumptions. The ways in which they wanted to achieve particular ends could be different, or they could disagree on an interpretation, but there was an overall discourse in which they had common assumptions. Having said that, later in the 19th century, in Bombay Presidency in Western India, I think what happens is you begin to get a crystallization of significantly different courses of action. What a realization that there were different possible approaches to how the nationalist project, the nationalist aims could be achieved. From the 1850s through to the 1890s, in terms of political action, these leaders had worked on several principles, one of which was that the way in which to bring about change in the position of Indians at the time was through trying to persuade the government to change its ways, to change its laws, its administration. So that was the way of offering protests, of offering petitions and offering memorials and that kind of thing. Then they thought that even though the British in India looked very powerful, in fact, decisions were really made in England. So the best thing to do was to try and influence Parliament in Britain, because Britain had the ultimate power of control. So, for example, the Indian National Congress sets up a branch of its party in London, and it tries to lobby, I think would be the term we would use.
Yes. Pressure group.
British parliamentarians, and one or two Indians even stand for Parliament and get elected. Dadabhai Naoroji becomes a member of the British Parliament, which has to be one of those extraordinary and strange moments. Now, that was the argument there, was looking at the logic of where power lay and trying to achieve change through getting at the basis of that power. After 20, 30 years of agitating, protesting, this produced only minor effects, and no further change seemed possible. So while that is happening, other people, like Lokmanya Tilak, are also becoming aware of the need to bring about immediate change. So Tilak, for example, begins to, in the 1890s, to argue that people have to oppose the government in India using people to protest. So you move to a situation of direct confrontation involving numbers of people. In one sense, Tilak built upon some of the activities amongst the farmers and peasants of Maharashtra, which Ranade had first trialled in the 1870s during the Deccan famine. And there's some very interesting grassroots agitation and protests that the Pune Sarvajnik Sabha led. But the Lokmanya takes that precedent and develops it into an outrightly clear political protest against the British Raj.
So what we get from your narrative is the divergence of opinions over there.
Yes.
The goal was the same. They were looking for political emancipation. Some were thinking that it can come very soon if we took the line of direct action, which was the thinking of Lokmanya Tilak. Others were trying to build up public opinion against the British and took the policy of protest, prayer, and convincing others that these are our political rights and you are the people who speak for democracy, so you should also share the power with us. So in one sentence we can say that the response varied from group to group, but the goal was the same, that was greater participation of Indians and the political emancipation from the foreign rule. Am I right?
Yes, indeed.
So from this we will go to the next question, where if we look at the social background, whether it's of Justice Ranade, whether it's Gokhale, whether it's Tilak, they all, maybe it's a circumstances, they all belong to the dominant Chitpavan Brahmin community. So when we talk of emergent new political ideas, so naturally the question may come that their social background had some bearing in their political thinking, in their political ideology. Do you also agree with this?
Partly.
Right.
Indeed, I mean, I agree entirely that the leaders you've quoted come from a particular community. They had been dominant in the Peshwa period in the 18th century. They were amongst the first leaders, the first community to take to Western education, to find employment in the professions, in the bureaucracy, as teachers and whatever, and they were extremely active in the political movement. But as well as those people, in Bombay City, there were other people who were also involved. Dadabhai Naoroji, who was the
Parsis.
Parsi, he was one of the most influential, important people. Ferozshah Mehta, who again was a major Congress leader and political leader. There was a Muslim, Badruddin Tayyabji, and there was a Saraswat, Talang, who were also part of the same movement. Now, all these people were at university together, they went through college, they often shared the same professions, and so apart from a particular Chitpavan elite, there was also an intellectual elite which did incorporate other communities. But certainly the most profound of the leaders of the 19th century would have to be, on the one hand, Justice Ranade, and on the other, Lokmanya Tilak. Obviously, these captured two very important events, and the intellectual quality that they brought to their leadership, the intellectual quality they brought to thinking about the issues was quite extraordinary.
But Tim, in the light of the recent research that has been done for the last 20 years, I can say, starting with Gail Omvett's book in 1976, then Rosalind O'Hanlon's on non-Brahmin ideology, and Jyotiba Phule, then Eleanor Joliet. All this research show that a strong non-Brahmin ideology was also emerging. Rather, that was a dominant trend in 19th century Western India politics also. So how do you visualize vis-a-vis the political ideology of the nationalist, whether it's a Gokhale, whether it's the Tilak, but none of them thought of taking up the cause of this section of the society who constitute the majority, whereas Jyotiba Phule was speaking in a different language. He says first the social emancipation rather than the question of political emancipation. So do you think that whether intentionally or not intentionally, whether it's a planned or not planned, but this issue did not get much focus in the agenda of nationalist ideology in the late 19th century?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and I have no argument with it. But I think what one should remember was that so many of these early leaders were concerned with social reform, and after debates about key practices, what they realized was that outsiders to a community, a caste, could not bring about social reform. So within any particular community, reform had to take place within that community by members of that community. Justice Ranade had contact with Mahatma Phule, and in the early 60s, 1860s, there was interaction. But the policy of action in bringing about social change at the micro level within the community had to take place by people from within it. The other way that some of these leaders might have answered your point would be to say that they were concerned with bringing about wide-reaching, wide-ranging social change, which involved making education available, improving the economic condition of the peasantry, the landless labourers, and so on, so that what was most important was macro change in which everybody would be involved. Now that applies to some of these people. Others were certainly not interested. But by the 1880s, 1890s in Western India, there are several other things that are happening. There's a non-Brahmin movement that's beginning to emerge, and there's also as well a Dalit movement. And so already some of the parameters, some of the patterns which we see later on in India's history are there in embryo. And I think that the other problem that was faced was the problem of priorities. Is political freedom to be achieved by fighting only for Swaraj, and therefore by concentrating all energy on this one objective? And many people decided that was the way they should go. Or was it to be achieved by bringing about a wholesale transformation of the nature of Indian society? And going back to Justice Ranade, were you to have a reformation within Indian society, change along all fronts, which is what Justice Ranade wanted. And in his lifetime he was involved in economic reform, economic development, social development, religious development, political development. And he pushed all of these things because his notion of what the nation should become was one of a nation which was moving forward along all sectors of society, using that in the broadest sense. Other people said that this was ridiculous. You couldn't wait till everybody was brought up to the same level. You had to fight for freedom straight away. And that becomes a basic difference.
At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century can be considered as the most crucial phase, when cutting across the regional identities, linguistic identities, religious identities, people were trying to focus on a common identity, and that is the national identity. So it's a great pleasure for all of us who have read Professor Jim but never got the opportunity to hear him. So thank you, Professor Jim, for your valuable time you have given to our university, and many of our students will be benefited through your interview, and they will be more interested to read your books. So thank you for all.
And thank you indeed.